A background of the idea for this seminar, because this is not the first seminar that we're doing. A year ago, I had an idea to work on the history of slavery as part of the mandate for the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. Why is that? Because the time period, which is often euphemistically referred to as the Renaissance, is of course the time of the largest forced transportation of human beings against their will in world history. It is not the only period of slavery. Slavery, as we're going to see, has a history, unfortunately, every bit as old as human history. But there is something different about the slavery in the time period of the Renaissance. Some call it the Renaissance. I prefer to call it the early modern period, and that is that period that begins in the mid-1400s and that really continues to the end of the 1700s. And what is different about this slavery are three things. Because yes, it's true, slavery has always existed. That doesn't mean it always existed in the same forms. First of all, the institutionalization of slavery per se, as opposed to its practice as an arbitrary response to war. What does that mean? That sounds rather complicated. Slaves had always been taken in wartime. There's nothing new about that. But it was not an institutionalized business which essentially condemned certain entire nations to slavery per se. Now, the condemnation of those nations, and this is the second point, had to do, in certain cases, with their ethnic background. You notice I'm not going to use the term race, because race is one human race, and I have to tell you, every time we talk about different races, you are feeding into the worst racists, from Adolf Hitler to David Duke. There's one human race. That is it. There are different ethnicities. The entire human race began in Africa. And so to a certain degree, we are all Africans. So the crimes committed against African slaves were indeed what we will call crimes against humanity. And the condemnation of certain entire nations takes place as a result of a very unholy collusion between two groups. And this is also what makes the slavery of the Renaissance different. Those two groups are the kings of Europe and the kings of Africa. And the kings of Europe and the kings of Africa together will take part in what was probably the dirtiest commercial business in the history of humanity. By condemning entire nations to slavery, I am referring to certain Native American groups who are the first victims of New World colonialism, and I am referring to certain African nations which were enslaved by other African nations and then sold to white slave traders. This very unholy alliance between Europe's kings and Africa's kings lasts from 1440, this is when we have the first quote-unquote legal shipment of slaves, meaning the king of Portugal bargained with the king of Dahomey in West Africa and brings a shipment of black slaves into Portugal. From 1440 legally to the mid-1800s. So you're talking about something that lasts nearly 400 years. So it is that condemnation of entire nations as opposed to the taking of individual slaves during warfare. This is a mark that differentiates the slavery of the Renaissance from any other slavery. And of course, the third point I think is going to be self-evident, which is the legacy of what slavery brought in the New World. Because if it is certainly true that African kings played an active role in dividing the profits with European kings, it is also true that the African in the New World would be the recipient of a type of brutality which itself would become institutionalized. And the fact that the United States needed a civil rights movement to even extend the vote to its black population is showing you how long that racism was institutionalized. Now, I'm starting with this very complicated point because there are often two very radical points of view taken on this issue, both of which contradict history. The first radical point of view is that there was nothing different about this type of slavery, and what are black people complaining about? No, folks, there was something different. Although, yes, you can say there was black participation, and the kings of Africa have their hands every bit as bloody as the kings of Europe. It is also true that the black African in the New World was invariably the worst position of any resident of the New World, and that the racism practiced against him and her would be institutionalized up to and including the end of the 20th century. So those who want to deny any African participation, that's not history. But those who also want to deny that slavery will have a particularly bitter legacy for African Americans, that's also not history. Is that point clear? Okay, because I think here, you know, with radical left and radical right, radical left historians and radical right historians are often very good about leaving certain facts out. I have to make that point clear at the beginning. Okay, because that double point is clear. Yes, black Americans are the recipients of the worst legacy of slavery. And yes, unfortunately, African kings were every bit as unfeeling towards their people as European kings were towards theirs. Because whether you were Louis XIV in Versailles, or whether you were the Ashanti king of Ghana, the poor for you were expendable. You truly saw no color there. This is class prejudice. Okay? It can also be religious prejudice. We can't reduce everything to class. There will also be people sold into slavery during the 15th, 16th, 17th, and into the 18th century due to their religious origin. One thing that you might not know is that many Jews and Muslims, when they were expelled from Spain, were sold directly into slavery because most Muslims and most Jews could not afford to pay the passage to get out of Spain. So for families that were obviously Jewish or Muslim, with whom the Inquisition would never really be content if they stayed in Spain and became what was called New Christians, unless you had enough money, you couldn't pay your passage out. And so many, many descendants of Spanish Jews and Muslims also will be sold into slavery on a religious basis. Gender will play a role, because women always get the worst end of the stick, as you know. And during the time of slavery, mass slavery, women were also subjected, as you can imagine, to mass rape. And I say this point because, you know, often when I would hear very high-class sociologists in NYU and Columbia University back in New York speaking about the problems of the black American family, I would often remind them that many of those problems begin when black women are raped en masse as they're taken across the Middle Passage. And that horrible experience which black women had will be repeated with another group from Europe, which was marked or demarcated as marginalized. Those will be Irish women. Irish women and black women together will undergo that horrendous experience of the mass rape, the gang rape on the slave ships. Why the Irish? How did the Irish get into this? Well, from the European point of view, they're almost as marginalized as black people. The Irish never quite fit into the European narrative. They were landless peasants because England had decreed that they be landless peasants. And they were sold into slavery at a rate only surpassed by that of Africans. One reason why, if you travel in the West Indies, and I'm saying all this by way of introduction, now, thank you very much. Sure. Now we'll actually get into the discourse. If you travel in the West Indies, if you are visiting islands like Barbados, has anyone here ever visited Barbados or Jamaica? Yeah, very beautiful islands. That accent that you're hearing is a mixture of certain West African accents and what accent? The Irish accent. So we see now this phenomenon is going to cross color lines, religious lines, ethnic lines, And indeed, all of the players in this very dirty corporate business knew exactly what they were playing with. In fact, one of the dirtiest players was the French supposed champion of liberty, Voltaire, who owned stock in several slave ship companies. We know of 3 that he owned stock in. He may have owned stock in more. Yeah, the writer of Candide, the one who spoke to us about universal values. So this was indeed the dirty, dirty business. And the first British abolitionist in 1787, Thomas Clarkson, always referred to this as a corporate interest. This was very much a money-making issue. And we have very strange testimonies from the 17th and early 18th century of good people, in quotes, decrying slavery but claiming that it's an economic necessity, you know, you just can't get away from it. It is an economic necessity. And I bring up these arguments to you because, of course, we are thinking of certain modern-day parallels, and I think you do have to think about those parallels because the mistreatment of any human being, sadly, has a very long history among human beings. What we have to remember is that there is no group that has been immune to this mistreatment, and now I say the nastiest thing, there is no group that has not mistreated. When Henry Louis Gates, who is arguably America's greatest historian, and an African American who teaches at Harvard, do you remember when he was locked out of his own house 8 years ago and tried to get into his house, and a white neighbor denounced him for breaking into the house? Well, you know, little issues like that, which are not little, and which are part of a legacy of pain that every African American has to deal with, are part of this story which has not yet healed. And at the same time, Henry Louis Gates will also tell you another story. He was very angry at his white neighbor. He had a right to be. And as he will tell you, he was equally angry at a group of African kinsmen whom he visited a year later, the people of the Dengue tribe in Senegal. Now, that tribe might mean nothing to you, but to Henry Louis Gates, who among other things is a great historian of slavery, both black and white in the New World, they mean a lot to Henry Louis Gates because the Dengue tribe was that group of Africans who basically were the representatives of the European slave owners and slave runners from Spain and Portugal and England. So he went to Senegal to ask them a question. He said, I'm going to ask you the same question I ask of my white American counterparts. Are you sorry? And the reaction was no. And Henry Louis Gates speaks about this, and I'm going to begin with this because what he calls the moral depravity of slavery that transcends all colors is something that has not healed at all yet. You know, he wasn't expecting them to say, I'm personally sorry. Nobody believes in collective guilt. We're not talking about that. But we are talking about having a conscience. And not having a conscience, apparently, is a disease that is limited to nobody, whatever their ethnic origin. So all that by way of introduction. Now let's start to compare the way this dirty business was run between the 2 major slave-running powers, Spain and England. When I say Spain, I am including within Spain the country that it dominated for 60 years that eventually will become the largest importer of black slaves to the Americas, and that, of course, is Portugal. And Portugal was taken over by Spain from 1580 to 1640. Let me give you some data. If we go throughout the Americas, if we go throughout Spanish America, how much of the population is black and descended from slaves? In Belize, 27%. In Brazil, which follows more the Portuguese line, close to 50% of Brazilians have African background. In Costa Rica, which used to call itself an all-white country, of course, we're discovering that, guess what, it never was. 2% of the population are Costa Rican blacks who have never disappeared, and over 40% of the population is mixed with African background. How do we know all this? From DNA. Uruguay is 6% black, Panama is 14% black, And my own country of Argentina, which used to tout itself as being an all-white country, discovers that it is 46%.
46.
Yeah. So we're talking about a whitening of history that was done consciously. Was it done in the United States? Well, I have news for you. Many more white Southerners than want to admit it are also part black. And if you know anything about Henry Louis Gates, he enjoys going up to both black and white Americans and telling them things that they don't want to hear. Because as Henry Louis Gates points out, there are very few people in this country who can call themselves either completely white or completely black. And as Gates also points out, that's a good thing. The problem is that so many of us don't accept it. But what I will tell you is that England and Spain and Portugal under Spanish rule had very different conceptions of how slavery should be perpetuated, although they both believed in its eternal perpetuation. What were the differences? The differences were legal fictions. So, let's start with Spain and Portugal, because they actually begin the slave trade. And if you want the date for the modern day, meaning the Renaissance slave trade, it would have to be 1444. And those are when the first black slaves are brought into Portugal. And then there's a little place in between the New World and the Old World where the slave plantation system is first experimented on. And it's experimented on to a terribly successful degree because the native population there that was enslaved, called the Guanches, was almost entirely exterminated. That area is the Canary Islands. And many of you may or may not be aware of the fact that the plantation system, which is implanted in the New World, first by the Spanish, then by the Portuguese, and then by the English, and of course you're aware of its American manifestation in the Old South. This is first created in the Canary Islands. Because the Guanches were almost entirely exterminated, Africans were brought in to replace them. Now, who were the monarchs involved directly in this dirty business? Let's call them by name. The first one was Fernando el Católico, Ferdinand the Catholic. Remember, the husband of Queen Isabella. Okay, and in 1502, I'm giving you the years not to impress you with my erudition, but so that you have a skeleton of historical truth to look at. In 1502, the first private authorization of slaves is made in the West Indies by Ferdinand the Catholic, by the King of Spain. Now, why am I pointing out to you that it's private? Because Spain had a very strange double policy on this question. Publicly, they were denying any role in commerce directly with West Africa and the slave trade. That's publicly. And you will find decrees to that effect. But they had an interesting legal fiction to get around that. And that was that the king could offer you what was called la cédula privada, a private seal, a private authorization, to enable you to import slaves just for your own use. And this is absurd, and thank you for laughing, because it is absolutely absurd. And so obviously what you had from 1502 to 1530, which is the year in which the private importations had become so massive, the Spanish government didn't deal with denying it anymore. But what you had from 1502 to 1530 was this fiction of, we don't really import slaves, just this particular nobleman needs about 20 for his own use, so we'll give him special permission. Okay, so this is legal nonsense. But it's legal nonsense that is foundationed until 1530. In 1530, Spain takes the mask off and publicly allows commercialization of the slave trade. Who is Spain trading with? Because it is a trade, and this is the awful thing. Welcome. The kings of Spain are trading with the kings of Dahomey, of Ghana, of the kingdom of Angola, which is now called Angola, and Senegal. These 4 countries in Africa joined forces with Spain, later with Portugal, later with England and Holland, in the establishment of what was the most horrifically booming business in human lives that we know of, and the longest lasting one. Let's talk about Christopher Columbus. Nasty person. And it should not be in any way, shape, or form romanticized. He takes the first Taino Indians back as slaves to Spain. 8 of them die in the passage. 2 of them survive and end up living their lives in slavery in Spain. The Taino Indians of the West Indies are completely enslaved from 1492, from that first voyage, to 1530. By 1530, 60% of the Taino population has been exterminated. And so Spain has to up its calls for slaves from West Africa. And that's fine for the kings of Ghana and Dahomey, because they now want what the Spanish are selling them, which is what? Guns. And so we get the beginning of the infamous triangle trade. What is the triangle trade? It depends where you start the triangle. But it begins, the usage of the term, the earliest usage that we know of goes back to the 1530s, and it is in Spanish documents from the city of Sevilla, which is Seville, which is where the slave trade was regulated by Spain for all of its New World colonies, Lisbon for Portugal, and London, of course, later for England. The importation of slaves starts to increase, and between 1530 and 1787, I give 1787 as the cutoff because that is the official founding of the abolitionist movement in England. 54,000 trips are made across the Atlantic in this triangle trade. And that is if we sum together the records left by Spain, England, and Portugal. 54,000 trips. I am not including supposed illegal shipping, so we can probably add to that. 54,000 trips is the low number. Where does the triangle trade begin? Well, let's follow the first mention of it from the 1530s. Spanish slave traders would take gold from the New World, bring it to West Africa, trade the gold with the kings of Dahomey and Ghana, who would give them slaves. Some of the slaves would be taken back to Spain, registered in the port of Sevilla. Some would remain in Spain. That was very interesting, by the way, a DNA study done in Spain 2 years ago. The entire Spanish population learned, ooh, guess what? You're partially African too. You'd be amazed how much of what thinks it's white Europe is not white Europe. Okay? And so, what happens to those slaves who are then taken from Sevilla? Some of them remain in Spain as domestic servants or domestic slaves, and some are taken back to the burgeoning plantations in the West Indies. This is the model that will remain in force through the middle of the 17th century. Now it remains in force with Spain, actually, till 1882, which is when slavery is abolished in Cuba. Okay, so I want you to understand that through the end of the 19th century, slavery exists in Spain's New World colonies. But when England comes into the fray, the situation is going to become a little bit more complicated. Because England and Spain were supposedly enemies to the death. Except, of course, the one thing they could agree on was the commerce of human beings across the Atlantic. But here, you're going to notice the class element comes in. With Spain at this point, it is much more of a color element. If your skin is black, you are designated as a slave. Yes, you can talk about some free blacks, but I want to be very clear historically. As Henry Louis Gates points out, their number in the Spanish colonies is so minimal that to simply focus on one or two exceptions and try to create this mythology that Spain allowed many black people to live free in its colonies is sheer nonsense. Sheer nonsense. So if it is Spain and later Portugal that use a more color determinant in slavery, once the native population of the Caribbean and a lot of the native population of southern Brazil had been exterminated by first Spanish and then Portuguese conquistadors, the English bring in the class element. And on English slave ships, which we're going to start to see in major vigor from 1630 on, now I'll explain a bit about the English slave trade, which was different to the Spanish one, but every bit as brutal. The English have a problem they think they can deal with very well through this burgeoning business they've joined. You know there has always been a very strong and linguistically evident class system in the British Isles. Okay? So some of you who can go back and remember the 1960s, remember that, yeah, it was a big deal when the Beatles spoke with working class accents. That was actually quite shocking to the England of its day. Well, the class system meant that there were a lot of people who were almost as distasteful to you as Africans, your own poor. And so the English begin a massive transportation of people they will call indentured servants to the West Indies. And this is the beginning of a racial and ethnic fusion which will make the Caribbean, I think, one of the most interesting places in the world. And this was not what the British were counting on. And it's not what the Spanish monarchy was counting on either. Because racism ran so deep that I think the higher powers that be could not foresee what would happen, which is that eventually many of these poorer Englishmen and then later many of the colonized Irish, transported by the British, would eventually make common cause with the black slaves. And this type of blending, which was absolutely incomprehensible to those who ran the slave trade, has a lot to do with what eventually will destroy the slave trade in the West Indies. So we commonly hear that there were no slave uprisings, or I've often heard this from students, why didn't the slaves rise up? And sometimes, unfortunately, the teachers have no idea of the extent of slave uprisings. But let me just throw out some of the major ones, because yes, there were many. Yes, there were over 200 recorded ones, and the most famous one actually began on the plantation of Christopher Columbus's son, Diego de Colón, back in 1522. So even at the very beginning of the early modern slave trade, you had uprisings. Now, when the British get the brilliant idea to throw poor Englishmen and the Irish, because the Irish for them are nearly, quote-unquote, as bad as the Africans, to throw them all on the same ship, they began to sound their own death knell. Because what happens in the West Indies from 1655 onward, that's the year that England takes over Jamaica from Spanish control. Of course, the Spanish had taken it originally from the Taino Indians, so, you know, we have this chain of conquest. From 1655 on, England, which was becoming the most active nation in the slave trade, apart from Portugal, and we're going to mention this again in 1 second, England begins to dig its own grave. Because by putting them all in one box, they also began to see themselves in one box. And you had the birth of what a very, very great Caribbean writer, Derek Walcott, calls the Caribbean identity, which transcends race. And so just as you know, if you've ever visited the islands, that every Jamaican and every Barbadian can point to ancestors from Africa, from England, from Ireland, from literally everywhere. That idea of, quote unquote, throwing all the undesirables together was going to undo England's own slave system. And the greatest proof of that we have is what happens in 1734. There is a massive slave uprising on the island of Jamaica. And I say massive, and I mean massive, because according to British chronicles, it included literally 2/3 of the island. Now that shouldn't surprise you, because on most of the Caribbean islands, the general population were slaves. And the quote-unquote free men, let's not even talk about women, the non-status women have always had, but the quote-unquote free men constituted a very small minority. In 1734, that uprising of slaves in Jamaica included black slaves, mulatto slaves, slaves who were already a combination of black and white, many poor Irishmen, many poor Englishmen. And it was considered to be such a horrifying phenomenon, probably due to its interracial character, that the assembly in Jamaica sent, it's very amusing to read this, a letter to London calling for reinforcements to be sent to the island in the wake of this hellish nightmare that could and might extend itself. I want it to be clear to you that as the 18th century draws to a close, and as my talk now will draw to a close, the slave trade was not becoming lighter. It was heavier. And here is one historical fact I do not want anyone to forget, because there is this myth that, you know, we have myths on the left and we have myths on the right. The myths on the left are that Africa played no part in its own slave trade. But we know that's not true. And the myth on the right is that, oh, we shouldn't have gotten so upset about slavery because if we hadn't, it would have died out anyway. No, not quite, folks. Neither of them are correct. We've already spoken about the deep involvement of the African kings. Well, let's talk about the fact that as the 18th century drew to a close, there is an increase in importation of slaves on the part of England, Spain, Portugal, Holland, and France. And in fact, the decade of the worst, meaning obviously the most extensive slave trading activity, was 1781 to 1792. So anybody who tells you that slavery was dying out by itself is a fool. It was not dying out. What will kill slavery eventually will be that movement created by Thomas Clarkson in England, which is the movement for abolition. And that movement's repercussions will extend through the Spanish and Portuguese Americas, and of course in our own country in the United States. I just want to make that point very clear in terms of American history as well, because there's a bit of revisionist history going on in the South, claiming that, of course, the reason the South got so angry when President Lincoln was elected was that his rhetoric was so fierce because slavery was dying out anyway. No, it was not. No, it was not. As the historian, very fine historian of slavery from Cornell University, Edward Baptiste, points out, the mere mention of simply containing slavery, because you know Lincoln was not an abolitionist. Lincoln was not talking about abolition. He was simply talking about containing slavery. That thought itself was such anathema to the southern states that when Lincoln, not John Brown, not the abolitionist John Brown, but Lincoln, who was actually much more moderate on that question, when he simply suggested not extending slavery, that is what caused the South to secede. And I point this out because we have the same type of revisionist history working in the early modern period as we do in the American Civil War. Slavery was not dying out. It was increasing economically. It was not dying out. it had to be killed. And it had to be killed on all fronts, whether those dealing with the slavery were the kings of Europe or the kings of Africa. They were both equally involved in this dirtiest of all businesses. Thank you very much.
I'm not a historian, so mine will be a little bit different, I hope. And I'm going to kind of walk through a couple of different examples, and then definitely we'll end with our most recent case. I hope this works. All right, so I'm just going to kind of talk in general initially about sort of the use of forensic sciences to inform history, just history more broadly. And just some fun examples to kind of walk through to kind of bring us up to speed on what's going on now. Tutankhamun. Many different theories about how he died, so issues of causes and manners of death. How old was he at the time of his death? Was an issue. He was a relatively young individual. And what, if any, disease processes might he have been suffering from that tied him to other familial individuals at that time? Billy the Kid. We believe that Billy the Kid was born roughly September 17th, 1859, and was either killed on the evening of July 14th, 1881, or sometime after midnight. There have been many questions about his actual identity. Was he killed that evening? Did he escape and disappear, literally into the sunset and become a farmer? Which is one story. And then most recently, an ASU faculty member, a retired faculty member, has subpoenaed the Office of the Medical Investigator in the state of New Mexico to produce a death certificate. There's no death certificate for Billy the Kid. Death certificates were not issued prior to the existence of the state of New Mexico, so going back in time. His thought is that if you were to issue a death certificate on the individual believed to be Billy the Kid, who was killed either on the evening of July 14th or early morning on the 15th, that was witnessed by a number of different individuals. His coffin was placed on display. There's photographic evidence of him. That then these individuals who are claiming to be descendants, their claims would be essentially put asunder because he would have been dead many years before they were born. Issues of identity, as you will see, and relatedness play out, and the forensic sciences, in particular genetics, has played a role in this. The death of John F. Kennedy, still controversial to this day, not necessarily that he's dead, we accept that, but how he came to be in that state. Recently, some ballistic studies, the study of the trajectories, again come to the sort of mathematical conclusion that there may have been more than one individual in Dealey Plaza. That relates to the number of shooters. Well, then, where are those other folks today? Recently, there's some chemical testing from the University of Texas, where they looked at the original the secondary chemical testing in 1979. Professor did a chemical analysis of 5 fragments from Dealey Plaza, and he found 2 chemical signatures. He testified before Congress that 2 chemical signatures suggested 2 different sets of projectiles, 2 different individuals. Okay. The folks at the University of Texas most recently, 2 months ago, did found fault with that kind of analysis. They repeated that analysis, as scientists want to do, and then applied new methodology to it. And when they repeated his analysis on projectiles, they had 30 projectiles in their sample study. One of the projectiles in their study matched that chemical signature from 1979, which is an impossibility in terms of manufacturing. Point being that if they were able to derive the same chemical signature today, that kind of shed some negative light on the testing that was done in '79. So we're always going back, we're always retesting. It's sort of the beauty of science. We're learning more and more. And then Jack the Ripper. Who was Jack the Ripper? There are many different thoughts on who he might be. We're assuming he's a he. And using some of the techniques in crime scene documenting things, going back to see if we can get any notion, particularly handwriting expertise, trying to get a handle on who that might be. But here's just some examples, and that doesn't work. Upper left is Tutankhamun. That is the mummified remains of Tutankhamun. To the right of that is a facial reproduction of what he may have looked like. There's been some CT scans of the remains and some detailed examination. One of the questions was that it wasn't a question, he had a fractured tibia, rather severely fractured, but set, that may have occurred during a chariot race. Kind of goes against what we understood about Tutankhamun being a relatively sickly individual, frail of health. So we've got these competing sort of theories, but CT scanning, bone scanning is giving us better insight into what may or may not have happened. There's one of the projectiles from the National Archives, and there's our friend Billy the Kid. And that is the one documented photograph that we're fairly certain is Billy the Kid. William H. Bonney, which was a name that he had adopted when he came out to the Southwest. So, forensic sciences can be used in many different ways to explore issues in history. It can maybe help enlighten history, maybe solve some problems or questions within history. So I'm going to talk about, we're going to jump around at least from North America. We'll eventually wind up down on the South American continent, like Sharonah said. But I'm going to start with this, because this is a story that no one knows about yet. You've all heard about her in one way or another. Jane McCrae. So, the heroine of Saratoga. Is anybody from upstate New York and got some sense of where Saratoga is? It's sort of north and west of Albany. It's a beautiful area if you're into racing. There's horse racing up there. But here we are in 1752 when Jane McCrae was a young individual. And I say she was likely killed by Native Americans. There are competing stories as to her death. So Jane McCrae is there in upstate New York. She has a fiancé, David Jones, who was a loyalist, so loyalist to the British rule, and he was part of General Burgoyne's group. And they were stationed at Fort Ticonderoga, again in upstate New York. So Burgoyne and his group were traveling south from Canada down towards Fort Ticonderoga. Now, Jane was staying with Sarah McNeill. Sarah McNeill is her cousin, distant cousin, all from a small area in Scotland. And that will become important in a little while. So supposedly on the morning of July 27th, a group of Native Americans come into, they were a party from Burgoyne, and they come into the village of Fort Edward, New York. And they take Jane and Sarah hostage. separate the two of them, and this is where we've got the written record versus the oral tradition of storytelling that will eventually evolve into some fun questions. So what happened next? Well, supposedly, one of the stories is a Wyandotte Panther. They were escorting McCrae. They were going to take them to the British camp, and supposedly there was a quarrel between the reward for her, and she's killed and scalped. Her scalp is taken back to the encampment where it's identified by her fiancé. So her identification is simply made on a scalp. Right. Second version of the story is that, in fact, the Americans were pursuing the Native Americans who had taken McCrae, and a small firefight occurs, and she's in fact killed by American, or the rebels, projectiles. And the historian Finney Baxter says that her body was exhumed and there was only bullet wounds and no blunt trauma or sharp force trauma from a tomahawk. Okay, so we have two competing manners and causes of death. Now, meanwhile, Sally McNeil is taken to the British camp, and we'll talk about her later. What we know is that she's dead at this point. And Burgoyne had hoped to use her death as a means to intimidate the rebels or the Americans at that time, and as a recruitment tool for his efforts. However, this didn't work out in his favor. The Americans, or the colonists, used Jane McCrae's death. There were songs about Jane McCrae. She became this legendary character. She is, in fact, part of the Leatherstocking Tales. James Fenimore Cooper's from Cooperstown, New York. Town's named after him. And in the book, The Last of the Mohicans, she is the character Cora. In the movie, and in the book, she dies. She and Hawkeye die. In the movie, the most recent movie, they kind of molded her character into Alice, who has a suicide towards the end of it. But so she is out there. She was in song early in the colonists' attempt to overthrow the British, and they did use her as a recruitment tool, and perhaps her death was part of the ability for them to overcome Burgoyne at the Battle of Saratoga. So we have two different stories. And can we answer a question? Was there a gunshot wound or scalping? That might help support one of these two tales that has embedded itself in history. In the book, in The Last of the Mohicans, part of the Leatherstocking Tales, she is indeed scalped. And like I said, in the movie, they don't even address that. That is a famous painting of the death of Jane McCrae. She's beset upon by Native Americans and scalped. So let's see what we can do. Okay. When Jane McCrae was killed, she was initially buried roughly in this location. This is supposedly where she was killed. This is up in Fort Edward. This is in April. Notice the snow. The snow becomes important. So she was initially buried here in this location, sort of just south of Fort Edward, and she was later exhumed in 1822 and moved to a cemetery on State Street, and she was exhumed a third time. So this becomes important. She was exhumed a third time, and finally is in Union Cemetery. So this was the original burial place of Jane McCrae. And you'll notice her name gets spelled different ways throughout history. I just chose the accepted spelling of it. So this is Union Cemetery. So here she's supposedly buried next to Duncan Campbell. And Duncan Campbell is a historic character, a regional character in upstate. He was a British officer and, in the French and Indian War. So supposedly they are buried together. And so in this small area. So in 2002, I was contacted by an archaeologist by the name of David Starbuck. At the time, I was at the University of Florida. And he had contacted the New York State Police because he needed forensic anthropology and DNA. And so he had done some of this work before. And one of the things that he had hoped to do was, one, if we did this exhumation, could we tell which one was male, which one was female? If there was any other trauma, could we identify that? And then ultimately identify the individual through mitochondrial DNA to living relatives. So this was the handwritten letter from one of Jane's descendants. And she offered locks of her hair, as it says, and that of her grandson. She offered up her grandson for mitochondrial DNA testing, so we had our samples prepared. So this is in 2002. It's kind of funny. I was helping David all along. So David had to go and get a court order to do this because of New York State statutes. We needed a court order, and not everyone took kindly to what David and the rest of us were going to do as part of the exhumation process. So again, this is April. There's white stuff on the ground. It's quite cold. That's the grandson there in the sweater and the coffee. I'm there somewhere, but I'm not outside because I'm not dumb. But yeah, no, it was quite an event. Exhuming what we had hoped was Jane McCrae. Even made the New York Times. Actually, the guys who removed this, removed the headstones made the New York Times. Because once we did that, we put up the tent, so to keep the press out. They had all sorts of volunteers from the Historical Society. Fort Edward is a very active historical society. Fort Ticonderoga is very nearby. They were proud of their history. And so a tremendous number of volunteers. And this is what it looked like inside the tent, doing our work, just to give you some sense of what it was actually like. There we go. So, there you go. There's a problem. We find evidence of more than one individual, but one skull. And that one skull is of an older individual than we knew Jane McCrae to be. If that older female skull had no trauma, no injuries, we're starting to deduce that this is not Jane McCrae. Who might it be? David Starbuck. So yeah, when we started doing, it's like, well, we have a problem, but who is the second person? So we had more than one individual. We knew we had two females based on the bone morphology, but we only had one skull, and that skull was from an older female than we believed Jane McCrae to be at the time of her death. That's me when I was a little younger. That's in the DNA lab. So we sectioned the bone for DNA. And ultimately, the DNA did not match Jane McCrae. Ben, the grandson, they were not a mitochondrial DNA match. So, where's Jane, and who's the other person? Well, Sarah McNeill, we traced her back, found someone in Scotland, and in fact, the skull belongs to Sarah McNeill. There's some wonderful stories about Sarah. Sarah was a large woman. We knew that her skull was very robust, just based on the morphology. And going back into the historic record, we discover that, in fact, she wore an officer's greatcoat when she rode her horse. So she was believed to be 5'10", 6 feet tall. So that would kind of explain the large, robust, but female bones that we found. And so you'll notice that she was exhumed. Sarah was exhumed, or Jane, sorry. Jane was exhumed 3 times. Her body at one of those times where she was buried was actually buried with her cousin. And then at some point they were both moved, as must have been what happened. And there's some other pieces of history that suggest that, in fact, Jane McCrae's skull was specifically taken after the second exhumation and is in a museum somewhere. We have yet to find it, and it's 2016. But that didn't stop them from making a really, really bad movie. It was, I don't know, I don't remember if it was A&E or Discovery, but it was terrible. These are reenactors they used for the movie. That's Jane there, looking terribly sad. That's actually an archaeologist from the Historic Society. And yes, she gets scalped. She gets scalped at every commercial in this hour-long episodes. It always ends with her being scalped. Now, in the movies, she turned out to be okay. Yeah, but that's Cora from the movie, and she does not die. So, who is Sarah? Well, we had Herb Buckley from the New York State Police. Was a forensic artist, and he did composite arts as well as forensic reconstructions. And he did this reconstruction based on the skull. So this is the robust skull of the older individual, the older female, who we believe to be Ms. McNeill. So we're working our way into things. So using forensics. So the problem is we can't. There are still 2 competing stories of how Jane McCrae died. We're not certain, but we at least tried. There's Jane, being killed yet again. All right, we're kind of getting a little closer. So Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was a young woman who was of mixed ancestry. Her father was a European planter, slave trader in Virginia. He had a daughter. His oldest daughter was Martha Wales Skelton, who married Thomas Jefferson. So Sally is her younger stepsister. Martha Wales was Thomas Jefferson's only wife. Sally Hemings was a slave at Monticello. So what do we know about her? Well, she was brought to Monticello in 1773 because she was inherited. Talking about the tragedy and the sort of the insanity of slavery. She was inherited by her stepsister, ultimately. She was brought to Monticello. because she's inherited by her stepsister and Thomas Jefferson. She's very young at the time. She's brought with her brothers, and 2 brothers. And then in 1786, she joins Jefferson in Paris. She's roughly 14, 15 at the time. During the time that she is in Paris, Sally and her brother are given monthly wages. They have jobs. They are servants in Paris, where they're much better treated than in the United States, and by law could have remained in Paris. And there's some evidence that she and her brother James were going to. He had become a chef. He was taking French lessons. And there's some evidence that she was as well. So Jefferson paid them monthly, whereas at the same time, if you were a servant or an enslaved person in Paris, you were paid annually. So you had hoped to get paid at the end of the year. So relatively speaking, and only relatively speaking economically, they were better off than their enslaved counterparts, at least while they were in Paris. In 1789, she returns to Monticello with her brother. She was very young. Her mother and the rest of her family was at Monticello. When she returns from Paris, well, she becomes pregnant in Paris. She returns to Monticello and loses that child. She then goes on to have a number of children believed to be with Thomas Jefferson. The one who, well, Madison Hemings and Easton Hemings, Thomas Easton Hemings, had several descendants. And they'll become important in a few minutes. So, Annette Gordon Reed wrote a book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy in 1997, that enlightened many people on the relationship between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. Sally was in no position to refuse her master. She was owned by the Jeffersons. And in fact, there was a newspaper article during the time period back in the late 1780s by a somewhat muckraker, who was upset at Jefferson for having lost some contract, and in this article he notes that there are light-skinned slaves at Monticello, sort of kind of poking at Jefferson, and nothing ever really comes from it, but it was published rather broadly. And then because of DNA, we were able to do, not we, but science was able to do some testing, and they did, and the year after that, one of Easton Hemings' descendants and an acknowledged Jefferson male were confirmed to share Y STR, so Y chromosome. This just gives you some sense of Sally Hemings' biological background. So she is the daughter of Betty Hemings. Betty was a slave on the Wales plantation. And then Wales' wife, Martha, the descendant of her is Martha Jefferson. So Martha and Thomas Jefferson married. They have 6 children, only 2 survive, and Martha herself dies before Jefferson goes to Paris. And then Sally and Thomas Jefferson have 6 children, perhaps 7, but the one who died when they returned from Paris. Again, this it's a little complicated, but it has a little more detail. It's essentially the same chart, but as you can see, the relationship, and these are the surviving children. And again, James Madison Hemings and Thomas Easton. So Easton's the one that we're going to follow for a little bit. And so this is a little more, I think it's a little easier to read. So they compared a descendant of Field Jefferson to a descendant of Easton, and they followed the YSTR. So basically, they followed the Y chromosome, and they found that they are a match. Okay. And this is just a little bigger. So what does it all mean? Well, there was a scientific commission that tried to push back against the DNA results, and their suggestion was that they didn't deny that the YSTRs from the Jefferson line are also found in descendants of Sally Hemings, but their argument was that Thomas Jefferson had several brothers, and so this was how it might have happened. It seems a bit disingenuous. When you have Thomas Jefferson was meticulous in his note-taking. His notes from the from Monticello note all of the children. He keeps a log of them. He never says that they're mine, but he notes their existence, and he made a promise to Sally that they would become free, or they would be emancipated on their 21st birthday. He unfortunately didn't do that. He emancipated her oldest brother, one who became a chef, and then one other brother, but he had to buy his freedom. Again, the economics of this are just that. These are economic transactions for human beings. Sally kind of goes off the rolls, after Jefferson dies, and you don't hear much about her until about 10 years after the fact. And all of a sudden, she does turn up on a list of freed persons, and it's not clear how she got on that list, but she and many others did. Her son, Easton, travels to Ohio and stays there, and many of his descendants, as you can see, some are European in appearance, but others are African. His older brother traveled to California and was the first selectman in California of African origin. So all Jeffersons, but different phenotypes. And these are some of the descendants of Sally. This is one image of her, one painting, and depending on which side of the family you followed, your phenotypic appearance was unique. So were they related? It seems most likely. They're definitely related to the YSTRs of the Jeffersons. And in fact, at Monticello now, when they hold reunions, the Hemings are welcome, which is at least a pleasant outcome, if you will, of what many people, including Annette Gordon Reed, has called it. It's just simply a systematic rape. It's administrative rape because she had no recourse. There was nowhere for her to go. So that's Sally Hemings. So now we'll move on to our final character. Chica da Silva is an interesting character. And, we've talked a little bit about South America and Portugal, and Chica da Silva, or Francesca da Silva de Oliveira, was, we believe, born in 1732 Could have been 1731, could have been 1734. We're not exactly sure. We know where she was born. So this is in the state of Minas Gerais, which is as the name translates to, it's general mines. It was a mining area. It was of principal interest to Portugal because of the riches that came from that area. She herself was of mixed ancestry. It just says a Portuguese man and an African slave, believed to be her mother, Maria, was from Bahia. So she is mixed as well, but was born into slavery because her mother was, in fact, a slave. This gives you some sense, and that's Diamantina on the right. It's a wonderful colonial town. So her first master, and this is when she was quite young, was a sergeant, Manuel Perez, and her second was actually a priest, Jose de Silva. And basically he was forced to sell her. And he sells her to João Fernandes de Oliveira. He owns a diamond mine, and he was the governor of the region, one of the richest men in all of Brazil at the time. He was an emissary from the crown, and basically he's referred to different ways throughout history as either the governor or the taxman or the tax collector, because that's in essence what his role was. So I've read several different biographies and delved into some of the controversies of Chica de Silva. Most believe that their relationship, even though she was initially a slave, was one of certainly friendship, one of certainly some sort of mutual agreement, if you will. They could not get married at the time; it was illegal. He frees her, so she is emancipated. And the controversy is that was she emancipated? Is she this great figure of Brazil's Afro community? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But they lived together for many years and had either 12 or 13 children. I was digging into some of the old church records, and it's not clear. But they were together for many years. And that's a little bit repetitive. But in 1770, the tax collector had to return to Portugal, and he took the 4 sons with him. And they were granted noble titles. And they stayed in Portugal. The sons never returned to Brazil. So Chica stays with her 7 daughters while he is in Brazil. All of her daughters, so she's a very wealthy, free woman at this time. In Brazil, she educates her daughters through the convents, this particular convent, and she maintains a certain amount of social status, a certain amount of prestige. She herself had slaves. And as far as the historic record goes, from what I can tell, she only freed 1 of them. So again, there's this sort of conflict between the character Chica de Silva and the person herself. One of her daughters stays with the convent and becomes a nun. So that leaves 6 potential descendants. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Potential is the key word. So I hope this works. I need to figure out if I can click on this. Because it does a little bit. It's kind of fun. I hope you'll think it's fun.
Oh, that's great.
as big as possible. Ah, oh, that was that. I messed it up. There it is. Why aren't you hearing anything? All right. Has anybody taught in this room before? Is there any reason why we're not hearing anything besides me not knowing how to do this?
Tell me if you click on the speaker. Yeah, on the speaker on the screen.
Okay.
See if that makes any difference. The symbol there.
I see all my students here. Anyway, I'm going to take still a different tack. And my talk this afternoon is going to be about a certain segment of a particular population imprisoned from early childhood for life, subjugated to rules and regulations of the relevant authorities, although this group, the targeted group of people, committed no crime other than having been born. So I'm going to share with you a chapter of a larger research project that I'm working on, which focuses on Renaissance and Baroque Venice. It's going to present a different perspective of, well, forced confinement and deprivation of freedom. So it does fit into the slavery theme. And the title is Resilience and Resistance, Marginalized Fashionistas of Early Venetian Convents. And as I take you to this magical world of Renaissance Venice, lacework palaces, flickering and gleaming waterways, opulence and decadence, creative liberty and political rigidity, we're astounded to find that, no, I need a little lighter because I can't see. Anyway, creative liberty and political rigidity, we're astounded to find that most patrician and upper class young girls and women, rather than languishing in the lavish lives they were born into, were instead forcibly locked away in the convents of the most serene republic, enclosed for life, with little or no recourse to ever step beyond confining walls. This segment of hidden women, cast away in the scores of Venetian convents, by 1642 comprised 3/4 of the city's female patricians, which are upper class and noble, most of whom took the veil by force rather than faith. Forced monachization, is what we call it, of daughters during the Renaissance in Catholic Europe became common practice among well-to-do families committed to endogamous marriages, that is, marrying within one's social class, and constrained by the dowry system, which was a cultural phenomenon, obliging families to provide money, land, or other valuable goods to the groom, consistent with the social status of the future couple. Patriarchal family strategies focused on reserving patrimony for the male heir, and possibly, according to circumstances, a selected daughter, thereby creating a population of surplus young females. The popular saying at the time, maritare o monacare, that is, marriage or the convent, couldn't be more true for these daughters, with the third choice, that is, allowing unmarried girls to remain at home, anathema to fathers and family. Keeping at home unmarried females after the age of puberty with no prospects for an equally matched marriage, presented social problems which were to be avoided at all costs. So with limited or no prospects to find equal or better earthly mates for their daughters, for all of their daughters, fathers deposited them in convents to secure an acceptable and often prestigious alternative, resulting in female religious houses filled with discarded daughters. Particularly in post-Tridentine Venice, that is after Trent, which was after the Counter-Reformation in mid-1500, the council mandated strict enclosure for female religious. In a city noted for its liberal treatment of nuns and having acquired a reputation for scandal, now ecclesiastical and state authorities instigated rigid surveillance policies focusing on monastic enclosure for girls and women, prohibiting nuns from stepping out of the convent, thereby securing their total encloisterment, complete separation from the secular world. Such structural modifications as barring windows and making them smaller, installing doors that lock from the outside, as well as raising the heights of the peripheral convent walls, would keep the nun inside. Other restrictions pertaining to control over reading material, visitors, and dress would keep the women free of the contamination from the outside world. The misery of forced lifetime confinement of young girls without calling can be heard through the words of Arcangela Tarabotti, she herself enclosed as a child in the early decades of the 17th century, never to step one foot outside of the Sant'Anna convent in Venice. She writes of her sister nuns' lives. These miserable, unfortunate creatures who were born into the light of day only to live from their innocent state until their death in prisons. Tarabotti compares her state with that, her state and the state of her convent sisters, compelled into religious life, to the early slaves of history, the unhappy Hebrews, conquered and exiled from their homeland, had the same punishment, which is cast upon the unhappy nuns. We cry over our servile state and our lost freedom. This convent inferno, Tarabotti writes, violently robs these innocents of their freedom. She seethes. Rather than being clothed in religious garments, they are wrapped in chains in this Stygian swamp of a monastery in which they are condemned to subservice and submission to the will of others. Nuns resisted in the few ways they could. Some recreated within their confines a continuity of the culture and societal norms that existed without. As the hierarchical dynamics, I'll get to this. Yeah. As the hierarchical dynamics of secular Venetian society penetrated convent walls, characterizing the conventual system, so did the ramifications of the ongoing querelle des femmes, which is the women's question, the women's debate, which reveals the general growing anxiety about what is a woman and what is her relationship to society, fostering at the time, heated literary and intellectual discussions, inspiring debates that positioned proto-feminists as well as overt misogynists to rail against such things as the vulgar display of feminine fashion excess. Laura Ceretta, the noted female humanist of the 15th century, expressed her disdain for elaborate female dress. Empty women who strive for no good but exist to adorn themselves, women of majestic pride, fantastic coiffures, outlandish ornament, and necks bound with gold or pearls. Her words underscore the ongoing tension concerning what a woman wears. Francesco Buoninsegni, in typical misogynist writing of the time, derides female fashion excess and the vacuous women who waste money on consuming the luxuries of attire. in defense of female choice, Arcangelo Tarabotti from behind convent walls writes, Il lusso è morale. Female luxury is moral. The debate and obsession about female attire, from patricians to prostitutes, suggests that we're looking at something more than outer garb. And in Renaissance Baroque Venice, early 17th century, we see perhaps the most bombastic and articulate language of dress in all of Europe. Women, in particular, with limited possibilities to participate in cultural or political spheres, found social expression through attire. I'm not there yet. Hold it. In fact, a Milanese cleric visiting Venice in the 17th century would remark that Venetian women, those who are able, as well as those who are not, dress very sumptuously. Indeed, women from the poorer middle and upper classes participated in an outward display of self, with cloth constantly recycled and reused. Even the less affluent woman could keep up with the new styles. She could dress to the hilt by trading or renting clothes from dealers, mostly other women entrepreneurs in the trade business. Through dress, a woman could enunciate the wealth of her husband, the status of her family, and her own standing in the world around her. This language was so potent a social tool that regulations were enacted during this period as never before. Although sumptuary laws, these kinds of regulations, go back to antiquity, 16th century Venice saw a flurry of new statutes attempting to regulate, especially female dress. Justification of this type of legislation ranges from an attempt to prevent political upheaval and maintain social stability to economic considerations and trade protection. Prohibitions, such as those against using gold and silver cloth for garments, could not, however, deter the fashion-forward Venetian women who circumvented the statute by, for example, inventing the slashed sleeve to show exquisite gold or silver lining lurking beneath the dress cloth. Determined fashionistas would not be deprived of their elegance. When the slashed sleeve was legislated against, the gold or silver cloth began to peek out from the cuffs in much the same way that noble women peered out from their window perches. Patrician women of Venice were indeed a sheltered species, appearing in public on their way to and from church or in gondolas with their husbands at dusk. Gentlemen do even coop up their wives always within the walls of their houses, so that you shall very seldom see a Venetian gentleman's wife, remarks the English visitor Thomas Coriat in 1609, describing La Serenissima, awash with riches and smug in its splendor. The protected position of Venice's upper-class women, although well within keeping of Italian early modern socio-cultural dictates, contraposes with the libertine social atmosphere that permeated the city, La Libertà Veneziana, giving rise to Venice's enigmatic reputation, meshing together admiration for her astonishing beauty, urban sophistication, and enduring political system with her scandalous display of social freedom, all playing out against a setting of overt religiosity. Venice's hidden daughters, doubly marginalized, housed in convents throughout the city, girls and women, most of whom came by force, strove to partake in the lives left behind. Maintaining and mimicking former lifestyles, they might also gain a modicum of control over their circumscribed lives. In response to the unnatural conditions of enforced enclosure and mandated restrictions concerning mundane aspects of their lives, the young novice's self-worth and personal value was undermined by subservience and subjugation, and this seethed at the surface. Among the limited ways these women, now morphed into nuns, could speak out and articulate their social persona was through their clothing. Although I'm not going to belabor the connection between language and fashion, I'm going to use it, however, as a powerful metaphor to emphasize the symbolic or semiotic strength of dress, particularly forceful in the study of women deprived of ways in which they could project individual identity, social status, and connection to a world from which they were plucked prematurely. Thus, for many women religious of Venice, the luxury of fine clothing and extravagant accessories brought with it personal power and control, an imitative declaration of participation in Venetian life, and a pronouncement of social status and personhood within their confines. Conceding that fashion is driven by the dualistic forces of distinction and imitation, a theory put forth by George Simmel, I find it applicable in the case of enclosed nuns desiring to dress as chicly as their lay counterparts, who are the Venetian upper-class women, considered the most elegant women of their time, trendsetters of the day. From copious records of patriarchal visits to Venetian convents over a period of hundreds of years, we learn the doges and patriarchs' strict monitoring of female religious houses, records of admonitions, rules, decrees, and injunctions issued by ecclesiastics to keep nuns in line, and constant upbraiding, pleading, mandating seemed only to foster nuns' micro-rebellions of immoderate display. There we go. Beginning with their most intimate attire, uncompliant nuns initiated the flouting of strict prohibitions by slipping into embroidered lace-trimmed silk camisoles instead of regulation woolen undergarments, marking a personal revolt and assertion of agency and womanhood. Even the corset, mandatory under the elaborate dress of secular women, saw its way into monastic houses and onto the bodies of professed nuns. Along with these fancy undergarments came a remarkably revealing décolleté, for which Venetian women of all classes were renowned. Fashion-forward nuns, eager to keep up with secular style, adorned themselves in prohibitively low-neck dresses, almost falling off their shoulders, a mode that can be traced back to the 15th century and lasting well into the 17th century. Such scandalous and sacrilegious show of skin prompted Patriarch Priuli in 1592, after his checkup visit to the Augustinian convent of Sant'Andrea della Zirada, to rule that neither the breast nor any other body part should be exposed. Also finding their way through convent gates were dresses of the richest fabrics, shot silks, which are iridescent silks, velvets, gold cloth, damasks, brocades in opulent colors of vibrant green, coral red. I'm a little ahead there. Regal black, and the extraordinary Venetian brocatelle with red, yellow, and silver welts. In the archived inventories of nuns' belongings, we find listed items such as fur muffs of zibeline, ermine, marten, and fox, ermine-lined coats, and purses trimmed in gold. Coerced religious, even in the enclosed courtyards of convents, continued in their deeply entrenched habits of luxurious dress. No amount of intimidation, including excommunication, could control what defiant nuns would wear and how they would live within their constricted circumstances. The continual prohibitions recorded, enacted over decades, lasting for centuries, attest to the will of the women and lax enforcement of authorities, who were well aware of forced monetization, deemed a social and political necessity for the stability of the Republic of Venice. Although doges and patriarchs worried and fretted, mandated and threatened the sartorial sins of nuns went largely unpunished. Nevertheless, the Venetian Republic had to avoid scandal at all costs, consistently attempting to keep Venetian virgins chaste and obedient, pure in thought, deed, and attire. Authorities ruled that hair should be hidden under low-worn headbands. They decried the curled locks leaking out. Here we go, leaking out of the forbidden fashionable head coverings. Secular Venetian women had long tossed off the veil as early as the 15th century, shedding the medieval head covering in favor of detailed styles of intricately woven lace that spoke of status and wealth. Hair was preferably blonde, Venetian blonde, a warm golden hue. Married women wearing piles of braids upon their head, unmarried women displaying long, flowing, and golden manes, maintained through systematic bleaching with natural dyes such as vinegar and lemon. In La storia di Venezia nella vita privata, Pompeo Mometti describes how secular Venetian women would sit in the sun on the roofs of their houses, certain areas called altane, in the process of lightening their hair, which they had treated with a variety of colorants, including saffron, white wine, and ammonia. Their tresses flowing over the broad brim of straw hats called solanas that had the crown cut out. In this picture here. Convent overseers ordered that nuns' hair be cut on a regular basis, and locks on the temples and curls on the head strictly forbidden, citing ringlets and curls as inventions of the devil. Nonetheless, insubordinate inmates bleached their hair, kept it prohibitively long, and imitated the fancy coiffures of their lay counterparts. Not even the exceptional action of Patriarch Querini in 1525, which years before Tridentine enclosure reforms, could set a cautionary example for the pampered patricians. Upon inspection of the convent of Santa Maria della Celestia, the patriarch spotted a young nun sporting long braids. In a furor, scissors in hand, he chopped off her locks, forewarning the others to keep their hair short and hidden. Notwithstanding such incidents, for more than 100 years following Patriarch Querini's outrage, and after Trent, we still continue to see archival evidence of never-ending invocations, not only against a show of hair, but also its length and color. Not by choice, nuns spoke in subtle ways. No amount of preaching and beseeching deterred those women who would maintain their lifestyles regardless of cloistered conditions. After losing one's freedom, what more can be taken away? One of the most extraordinary visions, here we go, of haute couture in holy places must have been the sight of sumptuously dressed women, religious, clapping around on their ciappines, or sometimes called ciappines in English, and in Italian zoccoli. This footwear, an extreme version of the wooden clog, 3 fists high, as English traveler Coriat noted, had been a shoe fashion favorite in Italy dating back to the 14th century, falling out of fashion in most Italian cities by the 17th century. However, in 17th century Venice, these high wooden platform shoes were still must-haves for ever-elegant women who reached new heights, actual and metaphorical, towering over their servants and husbands, whose heads they held for support as they promenaded to church and home again. Reaching heights of several feet, really. Zoccoli, as symbolic representation and the special prerogative of all who would imitate the upper strata, spoke superiority, prestige, and wealth of the many silenced women. Coriat remarked, "I have heard that this is observed amongst them, that by how nobler a woman is, by so higher are her cheapenies." The unlucky daughters, involuntary inclusura, articulated their station in the microcosmic societal sphere of the convent, mounting themselves on the height of foot fashion. Inside post-Tridentine fortified walls, as well as outside, women defied ecclesiastical tirades and sumptuary mandates, oftentimes risking wobbling right off their zoccoli. Time and again, patriarchs issued more and more specific prohibitions against tonsorial transgressions. Upon a spot check of San Zaccaria, Patriarch Vendramin in 1619 witnessed nuns in fishnet stockings, a sight that resulted in a special order precisely against fishnet stockings. On another visit, the Patriarch observed nuns sporting fancy shoes with silk laces tied up their legs. This infraction caused him to issue a prohibition specifically against shoes of the Roman kind with silk strings. As ecclesiastic convent inspectors continued to reveal an ever-growing catalog of infringements, the expanding list of injunctions grew more and more specific. Venetian nuns, most of whom had no religious calling, appropriated by their families while still children to cloistered institutions, straddled two worlds, two identities, juggling monastic seclusion with public interaction, maintaining autonomy through the cracks in a rigid yet porous environment, living on the margins of a society and city that should have offered them more. Rebellious nuns managed to maintain the semblance of their lifestyle, beginning with the very garments of their choice that they would put on their bodies, with the embellishments of beauty and the show of luxury and modernity that refuted seclusion and separation as they aligned themselves with their secular sisters to defy patriarchal mandates forged to deprive selfhood and autonomy. And that's it.
Thank you very much.
Why I come last. Just to make a connection, because Dr. Fredrick just made a wonderful connection between the other parts of this presentation, I want to make one more. What I'm going to talk about goes beyond the period that we originally think of when we think of slavery, but I think that that's a good place to finish this conversation of today, because as we know, what was called the colonial enterprise business, or other names that don't really express perfectly what we want to say about the consequences of colonialism, continue beyond the period that we first associate with slavery. So today I'm going to talk briefly about what we call the outer circle and the presence of English. So we've traveled to the Americas, we've traveled to Europe, and now I'm going to take you back to Africa and to Asia, to some of the places where English spread as a consequence of colonialism, basically after the colonial enterprise had ended slavery officially, at least. But you will see that the periods interweave and combine. And so, what is this expression, outer circle? I know that I have a couple of former students here that might know what I mean by that. So, basically, when we talk about the presence of English in different parts of the world, we talk of three circles. And this idea comes from a metaphor that is that of throwing a little pebble in the water, right? So if you do that, first you have an inner circle, then you have an outer circle, and then it continues to expand until the circle disappears, right? And so the inner circle of English is the circle of the countries of where English first originated, and then of the first diaspora, North America, the Caribbean, Australia, South Africa, for example. So the last time in this collaboration that we had, I talked about the formation of languages in varieties in the plantations of the Caribbean, and how during slavery, English came in contact with other languages, and because human beings have this wonderful capacity for language, even in situations of extreme stress and oppression, language found a way to thrive. What we're going to focus today is on the second diaspora of English, that which took English to places in Asia and in Africa, such as India, Nigeria, and Malaysia. So if you think of that first circle as the inner circle, these are the countries of what we call the outer circle. And then if we were, and maybe one day we'll have this again, and then I can talk to you about the expanding circle, which is the circle to which English continues to expand, all the countries where English is used as an international language, but where English does not usually have an official role or a default official role in education, government, etc. Okay? Now, don't be fooled by the idea of an official language. As some of you may or may not know, the United States does not have an official language. English plays the part of a default official language in the United States, but the Constitution does not designate an official language, which means we have, at present, about half of the states having called themselves English-only states where English is an official language, but there's nothing in the Constitution that actually says it is English, but that's just a curiosity for you to research a little further. Okay, so there are some things that I would like for you to leave with here today. The first of them is that where there is language contact, there is language change. Okay, there is language contact, there is language change. There are always forces trying to control language, right? And we've been talking about the control of the body and the control of people. Language is also used in attempted control. The good news is that even when language, there's an attempt to control language, it cannot be controlled. And so the forces of change always win. How do we know that the forces of change always win? Because we have a hard time reading Shakespeare in the original, right? If English hadn't changed, it would be very easy. But we now have to sit down and do scholarly investigations, right? And use a thesaurus or a dictionary or ask a professor, because language changes so much and so often. We only have to go as far as to watch a movie from the 50s, and we'll notice how different the pronunciation is, right? And for from a historical perspective, a movie from the 50s is yesterday, and yet we can perceive all of these changes. So the force of change is always the one that prevails over time. So in the colonies, English came in contact with a variety of languages. But English would also go back to places such as India, Malaysia, and Nigeria, and there both influence and be influenced by other languages. So that's what today is about. And when we talk about changing language, most of the time people think of pronunciation, right? Right now, for example, you're probably trying to figure out where my pronunciation is from. I'm not going to tell you. You need to be forensic linguists and figure it out. And by the end I'll ask you, right? And it's none of the places that I've mentioned so far. So change in language happens in all of the spheres of language: vocabulary, syntax, pronunciation, word order, whatever you can imagine, stress and intonation. Language comes to these features of language. Change comes to these features of language. Okay, so we, as you notice, this is not a typo. We're calling the Englishes now, because there is that huge an amount of variation that we can use the word in the plural. Every time I type it, in my field of studies, World Englishes, so you can imagine that I type it a lot. Every time I type it, Word tries to tell me it does not exist. So, every new computer I get, I go there and I say add to the dictionary so that it stops underlining it in red. We call it World Englishes now, and this is what I want to share briefly with you today. Okay, English in India. English arrived in India as early as the 1600s, so you see that there is that interweaving of what was happening in the Americas and then English in Asia. It was the first presence of the English in India was through the East India Company, right? There were trading posts established, and you will see that a lot of languages that become what we call lingua francas, they first become lingua francas through trade. So Somebody's trying to sell something, somebody's trying to buy something. They don't speak the same first language. They have to find a way of communicating. And so they establish contact in a lingua franca. At first it can be what we call a pidgin, a very reduced form of a language. But lingua francas are very common in trade and communication. And we know this because English is used currently also as a lingua franca in business and negotiation, in diplomacy, and so on and so forth. The thing is that in India there are actually thousands of languages. And when I say thousands of languages, I mean thousands of languages, right? We know about a few. Many of these languages are oral languages. And so you don't necessarily have a strong written record of these languages, but nonetheless they exist. So try to imagine a place where there are thousands of languages, and then English, an European language, comes into play. So the British ruled India from 1765 to 1947. And English, within that context, acquired official status. And that means that it was present and is present in education, government, and the law. So that is one of the implications of having an official language. You publish legal documents in that language. You teach children in that language. And it has official status in the government, and so on and so forth. India happens to have 18 national languages. So you can imagine what that means for administration. That means a lot of the documents have to be published in all of these languages, that you have to offer education in all of these languages, and so on and so forth. So there are languages such as Bengali, Urdu, Punjabi, of course Hindi, that has the official language of the Union of India title, Kannada, many different languages, right? And in that context, Raj Kashru, who was the first researcher who came up with this idea of the concentric circles, he explains that in that context, English ends up being actually the most neutral of the languages, which is something that we usually don't associate with English, English being the most neutral in that context. And the idea is that by being nobody's language, in a way it's everybody's language. And it becomes that language that is not necessarily associated with local loyalties to religion, culture, ethnicity, and so on. And so even though English has been, in many contexts, associated with imposition and imperialism, there is also that other side of the story that English acquired in that context a status as the most neutral language. Now, it's not necessarily British English that acquired that status. It's a locally generated variety resulting from the change and the interaction with the other languages. There are about 35 million speakers of English in India. It's not that large a portion of the population, right? It's like, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 5%. But in terms of millions of people, it makes it one of the largest English-speaking communities in the world, just because India has so many inhabitants. Okay, but then there is the opposite movement, right? We know then that English arrived in India and contributed many terms that for sure were borrowed into the local languages, but the opposite movement is also true. And so all of these words that I listed there, Pandit, thug, pajamas, cashmere, shampoo, bandana, cash, cot, bangle, polo, jungle, and khaki, all come from Hindi. And to a certain degree, maybe we are aware of a couple of them, maybe khaki, shampoo, even pajamas, right? But you know you were speaking Hindi every time you said cash. And then Hindi continues to contribute innovations into English. And then there is the local innovations from Indian English, the vernacular form. Some of them that I am going to make a plea right now that we adopt. One of them is prepone, that I think is very useful. It's the opposite of postpone. We have a postpone, they've created prepone, and I think it's wonderful, let's prepone the meeting. I think we should adopt that one. But other differences that we see in Indian English include progressive tenses, a greater use of progressive tenses for things that we don't use the progressive for. For example, and this one we started using, I think, because of McDonald's. I'm loving it. But all of these verbs that indicate emotion, we usually don't say I'm liking it, or I'm loving it, or I am understanding. In Indian English, the use of the progressive there is quite common. And then plural forms for things that we consider to be singular only or already collective. For example, equipments and staffs are very commonly made into pluralized forms in Indian English. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of that in a second. Okay, the second place I wanted to highlight for you is Nigeria. And English in Nigeria arrived a little later, but also by influence of trade. I have the exact date because I don't remember it by heart. 1807. And is directly linked to the prohibition of slavery in Britain. And so this whole idea of establishing trading posts in Nigeria is connected with that, which for them was an economic development, for us the result of a human tragedy. But in terms of economic development, there was a need to establish other economic ventures, and these trade posts were one of them. And so some of the things that were prized in Europe and were commercialized from Nigeria were palm oil, especially oils such as palm oil for soap and machine oils. And this became a booming business. We see English there being influenced by such languages Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa. And one of the things that can be noticed is a different stress pattern in words like salad being pronounced as salad. Perfume is okay for us, right? Most people here say perfume, but the British said perfume. And so that is a change from British English. Same thing with congratulate. British congratulate. And so there's a change of stress. And linguistic innovations such as the outgone president. We can adopt that one too. I think it's functional, right? Not only the outgoing president, the one that is leaving now, but the one that has already left, the outgone president. I like the next one very much, because it makes everything very reduced and quick and easy for people who text, right? So instead of saying turn on the light, you just say on the light, and on becomes a verb. Please on the light instead of turn on the light. And she seniors me instead of she is my senior. She seniors me. So this idea of transforming words from other classes into verbs it's also a linguistic innovation in Nigerian English. Different pronunciation in words such as singer, that becomes singa, or exam, that becomes exam. So instead of, we would usually represent in phonetic form this with a G and a Z, it becomes voiceless. Now, the big question is, are these signs of innovation or are they mistakes? And whether you answer one or another depends on where you fall in this continuum that goes from prescriptivism to descriptivism, right? And so the more you say things such as don't end a sentence with a preposition, don't split your infinitives, don't do this, don't do that, the more you are on the prescriptivist side of the continuum. The more you say, this is what people do in Nigeria, this is what people do in India, this is what people do in Arizona, the more on the descriptivist side of the continuum you are. And just to ease your minds, we're not at one side or the other of the continuum all the time. It depends on purpose and audience and what you're doing with the language at the time. So if I'm in the classroom and I'm teaching composition and I'm teaching the students to write academic writing, I'm going to be a little bit more on the prescriptivist side than when I'm writing my books about social linguistics, where I'm describing what people actually do with language, okay? And then the other continuum, and this is actually not a continuum, that's why I just put the little dots, that I wanted to call your attention to, is the idea that language, and these are terms from physics, so bear with me, because I'm a linguist, I'm not a physicist, but languages are under the influence of a centripetal force and a centrifugal force, or a centrifugal, depending on where you're from. And this is basically the force, so the way I describe it to my students is like this. The centrifugal force is the one of the washing machine. When you open your washing machine, the clothes are all glued to the walls, right? And that's the centrifugal force. If the washing machine didn't have walls, what would happen to the clothes? They would fly out, right? And the centripetal force is the force exerted by the walls, keeps the clothes inside. So I probably think that you already understand the metaphor there, right? So users of language, speakers of language, are always trying to expand the boundaries of language with linguistic innovation and linguistic change, right? And you can see that by what teenagers do with language, right? Anybody who's been called yo knows that, right? They're trying to exert that centrifugal force on language. And then teachers, dictionary writers, grammarians, institutions are trying to do the opposite by saying things like, don't split your infinitives, don't end your sentence with prepositions, and so on and so forth. And so we have those forces, but which one wins after all? What do you think? Right, and that's going back to the whole Shakespeare idea, right? We know that what's standard today will not necessarily be standard tomorrow. That doesn't mean that the centrifugal force, the centripetal force, doesn't have its role, because we still want to understand one another on a daily basis, right? We don't want that change to be so fast that anybody starts doing whatever they want and we go and say, huh, because they just changed the language as they pleased. I'm sorry, I pressed something wrong. So let's see how we go back. Okay, this is it. It's kind of a video game here, like Tony said. Okay, the final place that I wanted to visit is Malaysia. English also gained prominence there because of the India company that had a regional post there. There have been the presence of traders there since the 17th century. And we can talk about two varieties of language, Malaysian Standard English and Manglish. And Manglish, yeah, it's something like Spanglish, right? It's really a hybrid of both languages. There was a big nationalistic push starting in the 70s after independence in 57. And so there is actually worries about the decline of English currently. Whether this is a good or a bad thing depends on who you ask. And I just listed some of the interesting things about Malaysian English. A parking lot is actually a parking space. So if you say, park your car in the parking lot, you're referring to the actual parking space. A cell phone is a handphone. You bank in a check rather than deposit. And if somebody says they are outstation, that means they are out of town. And my favorite one, and it's very common in Malaysian English, is this expression la, which is very hard to translate. It comes from Chinese. But it's just something that you put at the end of sentences, almost like an emphasizer. So it's not very different than saying, I'm tired, yo, like teenagers would do, right? It's just an emphasizer that you add for conversational fluidity. So saying something like cannot la would mean something like, I'm sorry, that's not possible. So you can see how people manipulate language to make it succinct and serve their own purposes. And so with that, and I've mentioned the expression to you, English is a lingua franca. When we talk about English as a lingua franca, that is English that is used around the world for communication, whose rules are we talking about? And who decides whose rules to use? Do we say, American English is the best, British English is the best? And these are not really considerations for social linguistics. What we say in social linguistics is these things are decided in context, depending on the function, right? And so, again, if you don't remember much from today, one lesson that I would like for you to take is the idea of purpose and audience. We shape our language according to our purpose and our audience, right? And we make those changes all the time. So I always tell my students, if you speak to your professor, do you speak the same way that you speak to your best friend, or to your parent, or to a young child? And usually their answer is no, I change every time, right? So we are making these purpose and audience adaptations all day long, and we just don't realize that we're doing that. And so to say what variety is better would not take into consideration purpose and audience. So we have this idea of new Englishes. We can speak of Indian English, Malaysian English, and Nigerian English, but we can also speak of Singapore English. We can speak even of Japanese English and Chinese English, which are emerging varieties, right? And we like to think that we have a lot of control over language. Again, this whole idea of control, but we really don't. You know, and to my students, I often say that we as linguists would like to be able to send a memo and say, from now on, this is what we're doing. But it really doesn't work that way. Language has its own way of changing and adapting, and that's a good thing, that it adapts to the contexts it serves. Because I'm a social linguist, lots of people ask me what the future holds for English. The closest thing we've ever had to a global language such as English is Latin. We all know how that ended. But the problem is that, unlike Latin, we now have global communications at a very large and unprecedented rate and volume, right? We also have digital communications, which is something that we've never had before. So your guess is as good as mine. We tend to say that in the foreseeable future, English will remain a language of wider communication, but nobody knows for sure if these global forms of communication are enough to glue it together, or if these new Englishes will develop into new languages, the same way that, you know, Latin didn't really die, it transformed into Portuguese, Spanish, Romanian, Italian, French. These are the bigger ones. And so global and digital communications are really the key to the future of English as one language or as many Englishes. On that note, today actually, my book came out today, so I'm celebrating with you guys. And it's actually about that, the social linguistics of digital Englishes. And so I'm very happy and hope that some of the things that I say there actually come true. So thank you very much.